you know, Paul has been taken prisoner, and he is going to be standing before the council here as we get into chapter 23. And he just begins his defense. And he just says, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day in verse 1. And then we see him being struck on orders by the high priest. And there's a possible rendering of what that might look like as far as being before the Sanhedrin, with being surrounded with 70 people, and you have the high priest there on the top part of the picture. You're just surrounded. It's meant to be very intimidating, as you can probably imagine. And you're there giving an account for your situation. Well, the high priest has Paul struck in the mouth, and at this, Paul calls him a whitewashed wall. Just another way of talking about the high priest as being a hypocrite. I'm sure on the outside he looked really good and holy and righteous, but inwardly, of course, would have been evil. And you do some looking at that, and it seems like he was pretty well known for being corrupt, for being greedy, even stealing tithes from the poorest of the priests, just kind of a tool of the Roman Empire. But upon learning that this was the high priest, Paul essentially apologizes, saying that he didn't realize that that's who he was, that he was a ruler. And so, of course, that conversation goes on there in the first few verses of our text here. But Paul quickly realizes that one part of the assembly was Pharisees and the other part were Sadducees. And Paul takes the opportunity here in verse 6 to say, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And so he mentions this, and they just kind of go crazy. Makes those who are supportive of the resurrection, the Pharisees, say, you know what? Who's to say that all this that he did, it wasn't the right thing? And then, of course, there's just a big uproar that comes from all of that. He's on trial for believing in the hope of the resurrection, and this violent dispute breaks out. And, of course, as we probably all know, the Pharisees and Sadducees are pretty notorious for their fighting and bickering over disagreements concerning the resurrection. But it apparently gets pretty bad because you get to verse 10, and it says, as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So that's pretty bad. If you're wondering if the guy's going to get torn in two, that's pretty bad. That's a pretty big dissension that is talked about there. So things are not well there in that situation. But the following night, we're told in verse 11 that the Lord stood at his side and said, Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must also witness at Rome also. And so there is some encouragement that is given to Paul as he's going through this entire process. And wouldn't you know it, right after those words, there's a conspiracy that forms, and there is a plot for his death that develops. And there's about 40 Jews here or so, it says, that take a vow that they're not going to eat or drink until they have killed Paul. And so they make quite a vow here. They're going to bring Paul back to the Sanhedrin. On the way back, they're going to make sure they ambush him and have him killed. Well, as Paul's nephew finds out about this conspiracy and reports the information ultimately to the Roman commander there, and is able to get that information known to him. Well, because of this plot over the life of Paul, the commander orders 2 centurions to get a couple hundred soldiers, 70 cavalry, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea. This is verse 23. And so that's a pretty sizable group of people that is put together here. We find out that he's going to be sent to Felix in Caesarea. Caesarea is around 70 miles, 70, 75 miles away from Jerusalem. And in Caesarea is Felix, the governor of the region. Historically, men like Tacitus and Josephus, they declare that Felix was totally corrupt. They accuse him of bloody massacres and repression, not the greatest of people, as often is the case in the people that we're talking about, right? But he's not really known for very good things. And we find out the commander's name is Claudius Lysias there in verse 26 as he addresses this letter to Felix. He sends a letter with Paul and the Roman escorts, and they go through the night bringing him to Caesarea. Verses 26 through 30 is this letter that Claudius Lysias writes, basically saying, we don't really know what's going on here. There's questions concerning the law. We don't really know. It doesn't seem like he's worthy of death or anything like that, but you kind of figure that out in the process of things. But it's good that he makes a move there to save Paul's life. So now we have Paul going to Felix, and Felix agrees to hear from him at the end of chapter 23. But we find out at the beginning of chapter 24 that there's 5 days that have passed, and Ananias the high priest comes to Caesarea along with some other Jewish elders there, and they bring a lawyer named Tertullus who's going to try this case against Paul. And the first 9 verses here, we read about what Tertullus has to say. And basically there's 3 specific things that he lays charges against Paul concerning. Of course, there's some pomp there with trying to build up Felix and, you've done so many things and you're so great, and all things like that. But the 3 main points he brings up is that Paul is an agitator among the Jews throughout the Roman world. This is verse 5. The New American Standard says he is a real pest and someone who stirs things up. So he is an agitator. He is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And number 3, he's tried to desecrate the temple. So that's the 3 things that are the charges laid up against Paul that they are making their case with. And of course, Paul is given the opportunity here to then go through and talk about these things. And when he's given the nod to be able to speak, he addresses Felix there in verse 10. And he tells them, and we find out a little bit more of a timeline here, that there's been 12 days. 12 days have passed since he was arrested back in Acts chapter 21. And his rebuttal to this, verse 12, neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. So there's nothing to these charges. I've not caused any kind of disturbances. So they say, you are an agitator among the Jews. I haven't done anything like that. Secondly, verse 13, he says, nor can they prove it to you the charges of which they now accuse me. So you're going to call me an agitator, you're going to call me a ringleader. There's not anything to back that up. The Jews can't prove these charges. There's no evidence to back that up. But he says, I will admit to you, this is verse 14, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that's in accordance with the law and what is written in the prophets, and having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So his third main point is that, I believe everything that's in the law and the prophets. Wow, that sounds controversial, doesn't it? It shouldn't have been. I believe the same thing these people are telling you about their belief. And so as Paul goes through here and talks about these things, there's no evidence. I haven't caused any problems. I believe the things that are written in the law and the prophets. really the only reason he's in Caesarea is because he's being judged concerning the resurrection of the dead. Is the point there? And so he talks a little bit more about that in a couple more verses, talking about how there should be more people here making accusations if they had a problem, but these are the facts that he lays out here. And I'm not a lawyer, and you're probably not either, but you think about a case like this with all these things laid out, and I don't know how long that should take to make a decision, but there's some time that takes place here in making this decision. And we find out in verse 26 that, verse 26, that Felix is hoping that he's going to make some money from this. He's hoping that there's going to be some money paid to either move this along or receive some money by Paul that's going to help him in this decision-making process. But he sees this as a money-making opportunity, and he's hoping that they would give him some money for Paul's release. But we also find out that he's having opportunity to hear Paul preach, to hear what he has to say. Verse 25, of course, very well known. As he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." And so that's rather revealing as to motivations. And of course, then the next verse talking about how he's hoping to receive some money from Paul for his release. But we hear what Paul has been talking about. We see here that he's talking about righteousness and self-control and the judgment. Felix is frightened by those words, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but he's frightened about that. He certainly would be one that would be fearful of the judgment. And so when you put all that together, it doesn't seem like it should be too hard of a case. Of course, that's just me talking with my biases, I suppose. But there's 2 years that go by. Verse 27. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. That's a long time. 2 years going by. 2 years to have this case that shouldn't even be a case, and Paul is left there. Well, that's where we're going to end as far as the narrative goes. Well, let's talk about a couple things here for some things we can think about anyway. And the main thing is I want us to think about how God works a little bit. God works through small things and small circumstances. Now, this isn't a huge move that's been made as far as what Paul was doing and how these things were being accomplished. God uses small things to accomplish his purposes. So many times we're impressed in the scriptures how God uses big things, and big things happen and amazing things take place, and you're like, wow, that's incredible in the accomplishment of God's will. But too often we overlook the way that God works through smaller things to bring about his plan. I say smaller things, I'm not necessarily talking about the 2-year period. That seems kind of big, but just an incident that takes place back in chapter 21. Just Paul being seen with a Greek in the area. Just Paul going through and teaching. Just a situation that's there. Just a few words that are spoken, and all these things kind of snowball. Small moves, and yet we have insight into where this is going based on what the Lord said to Paul in the encouraging words there that we read earlier. Paul's going to end up in Rome, and that's the will of God. And we see kind of these small moves that kind of ultimately lead him there. Of course, we'll see more in our next lesson as he gets to be around Festus. But just think about those kinds of moves, just small things, just conversations and incident matters like that end up being what God wants, ends up being his overall plan. And that really is something that illustrates to us just kind of how the scriptures work in so many ways. That is kind of the story of God and his power. We find even in the very beginning, man being created out of dust. What is dust? It's nothing. It's something just tiny and small, and yet God uses his power to accomplish such great things, even from the dust of the earth. He could have used a much grander substance to create man and woman, and yet he doesn't. He doesn't do that. And of course, that ends up being a bit of a lesson. To dust you are, and to dust you will return. That's what we are made up of, and yet it's such a small thing. But how many times has God used such small circumstances, small people to accomplish such great things? You think about someone like David. David, really a nobody. His father wasn't really anybody of any significance. And when it came time to appoint a new king, David's not even there. He's so insignificant. He's the one keeping the sheep while the grown-ups do the big work. But we know how that story played out. None of the other brothers of David were the chosen one. It was him. And we know what God did with him. God used David to become one of the greatest kings ever, if not the greatest king of Israel. God using small things and people to accomplish his purpose. Moses certainly wasn't really anybody. He didn't really even like the status of being raised up the way that he was in the Egyptian culture and education. He flees away from those things. He goes to Midian. He's a shepherd for 40 years. Probably thought that was as good as it was going to get. I'm doing my thing over here, and yet God calls him to do this great thing of leading his people through that great exodus. And someone who didn't want to do it, had every excuse in the book, and yet God used him for that purpose. Even Jesus being born, the virgin birth with Mary, from a unknown place, an insignificant place, in a town that wasn't relevant for anything, and grew up in a place called Nazareth that wasn't anything as well. Can any good thing come from Nazareth? Apparently. But yeah, God delights in using these small, insignificant things. And that's also true concerning the trials of life, the things that people go through in life. God can use us even during the darkest hours and most difficult times to accomplish his purposes. And even things that don't seem significant can end up being significant. And you think about the case with Joseph, someone that his brothers hated, someone that seemed like he really got a bad rap. He didn't deserve to be sold off into slavery and thrown into a pit and all of that. He didn't deserve to be put in prison and have all these terrible things happen. An insignificant individual, and yet God is still with him through all of that, and God uses him for his purpose. In fact, it's not a small purpose either, is it? That's how the entire nation gets down to Egypt. That's how everybody comes to be in Egypt, is through this small individual Joseph. And who would know it at the time when you're reading through it? Of course, we know it now, but in the moment, who would have thought that would have been anything other than, why has this happened to me, and why are all these terrible things taking place, and I mean, all the things that could be said about that. We know that Joseph continues to have faith in God. He continues to always be with him, just as God is with him. And yet that meant prison. It meant being forgotten. It meant being accused of all sorts of things you didn't do. And time goes on and continues to go on until God's time comes about. And even after all these events come about, and the brothers are there, and all they're reflecting on this, and Jacob dies, and the brothers are fretting over, well, what's going to happen now? Now that Dad is gone, what are we going to do? And Joseph makes that point there in Genesis chapter 50. You all did this, and you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God had a purpose. God had a plan for all of that, and all these little tiny things that happened to someone who wasn't significant. It was pretty significant overall. So that's something for us to think about. And of course, what about us? What about us? We don't really know what God's purpose is. We certainly don't know specifics many times. God's purpose may be nothing more than our day to day going through and working our faith and growing and continuing to do those things. And all of that is very important. But who knows who you might talk to or the influence you might wield or the people that you may get to meet and have an impact over? Who knows where that leads? The people that you can have a impact with. And we see over and over in the scriptures, that's how God works. He works through people, and he works among those even who are not significant. And so that's really something we should think about and really be impressed with as we consider our life. And, well, we're not anybody. We're not anybody important. We don't have a big influence. And, well, you know what? God views us as important. We are not a nobody to him. We are significant in that we do have an impact. We do have an influence with other people. And we don't know where that can lead. You can't just discount it all because of what our perception is whenever we see time and time again God working through these very people. What will you do with Jesus is a good question for us to think about. And, the leaders we've just read about in these two chapters here, they have some different perspectives of things. Ananias, the high priest, should have been somebody that knew all about the law, should have been someone who was looking for the Messiah, should have been someone who was very knowledgeable about all these things. He didn't care anything about Paul. He doesn't want to hear what Paul has to say. Don't bother me with facts. I don't want to know those things. And he just doesn't seem like he cares at all and doesn't want to hear what Paul has to say. He just wants Paul dead. He just wants him out of the way. And so when Paul talks about these things, you have some that were like Ananias. They heard this, totally tuned it out. They had ulterior motives. They had the way they wanted things to go. They had the power to back it up. And that's the move that they made when it came down to Paul talking about Jesus, Paul talking about the Savior and the Messiah. You also have people like Claudius Lysias, the commander. There's no doubt that he saved Paul's life. There's no doubt about it that he did that. He allows Paul to speak and talk about the things that are happening as he made his defense there in chapter 22. However, he did try to have him beaten. He did do all of that, and that was how we found out that he was a Roman citizen. And I kind of found it interesting as well when you look at the letter in chapter 23, verses 26 through 30. You read through that letter. Isn't it interesting that he doesn't talk about that part, does he? He says in verse 27, when this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came upon them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. He kind of left out, I put him in chains and was getting ready to beat him, and then, okay, he's a Roman, so I better undo that. So not exactly the most honest description of events, but he did rescue Paul, and he does do these things in an attempt to save Paul's life. So there's some good qualities there. Who knows what he heard from Paul, and who knows about how all that eventually played out with that. Antonius Felix became the procurator of Judea in AD 52, remained in office to around 60 when he is recalled by Nero to face charges of cruelty and corruption. Imagine that, politician. Tacitus and Josephus paint him as being brutal and an incompetent politician. But Felix does hear Paul speak about his faith, as we talked about some. He does hear him talk about Jesus. He does speak about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come with Felix. Felix isn't too thrilled with that. He's not too excited about that. He's frightened. He doesn't really want to hear that. Felix would rather not think about those kinds of things. He apparently had a thing for women named Drusilla. His first wife was Drusilla of, I can't pronounce the word, Mauritania, who she was descended from a royal line and was second cousin to Emperor Claudius himself. But then in Judea, he sees this other woman that we read about in verse 24 there, named Drusilla, and she is the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, the former king of Judea. He's the one we read about in chapter 12, the voice of a God and not a man, who's eaten by worms. But he falls madly in love with her on account of her beauty. This is according to Josephus. She was married to the king of Emesa, but Felix hired a man, some say he was a magician, hired a man to persuade her to leave her husband and to marry Felix. So Felix divorces the first Drusilla, marries the second Drusilla. The second Drusilla divorces her husband, and that's how we see them here in verse 24 of chapter 24. Some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul to hear him speak about Jesus. So a lot of backstory there, a lot of history, a lot of things that would make you say, oh, that's why he doesn't want to talk about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. But that's kind of the backstory on some of that. But another person that's introduced to Jesus that has to make a decision with what are you going to do with Jesus? He really didn't want to hear about that. Oh yeah, I'll get back to you on that, Paul. He's got 2 years, and we don't know any more about it than that. So as we close tonight, think about the choice to follow God, just how important that is. Why continue to ignore him? Why would we continue to ignore the evidence that there is all around us? The universe declares the glory of God. We can look around us, we can see the planets and the stars and the seasons and the trees and growth and the nature around us. We can see that there is a God if we'll look at that. The scriptures declare there is a God. History declares there is a God. The empty tomb of Jesus declares there is a God. But so often people look at all that and they suppress all of that to just believe a lie. Because it's the popular thing. People believe that. A host of reasons. But people suppress it and believe what they end up wanting to believe or what they believe will be in their best interest. But as Jesus said, what good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? What good will it do if you ignore the evidence? If you choose not to follow God? What's the point of living the way you want for just a few years, only to be held accountable for all eternity? But that's the choice that we have and that we each have to make. Your parents can't make it for you. You have to make it yourself. And that's what we are left with. What are we going to do with Jesus? How do we view him? How are we going to live our life? And are we willing to be held accountable for our life without him? You have the opportunity tonight to change that. If you're not a Christian, it starts right there with becoming one. Becoming a child of God, because you know that without him, all is lost. You can't have forgiveness of sins. You can't have the hope of heaven and eternal salvation without him. Because without him, it's just us and judgment and our sins. Who's going to pay for it? It's going to be us, because we're guilty. But with Jesus, he paid the price for our sins. He went to the cross. He died for you and I and made it possible for us to be seen as forgiven in the sight of God. For us not to be separated from God, but to be reconciled back to him and to be viewed as righteous before him and in his sight. If we can help you tonight in any way, we'd like to do that. If you let it be known by coming forward, together we stand and sing.
When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and night shall be no more, and the morning rays eternal bright